Good day. The first thing to do, starting this program, is to apologize for the fact that the video I did yesterday only got published today. This is entirely due to technical problems with uploading, problems that are only partially under my control in the sense that I'm not a particularly skilled technical person. At any rate, the video came up, if rather late, and I hope those of you who watched it have found it helpful. But anyway, this is today's video, and I'm now going to deal with the latest developments, of which the key ones, of course, relate to the NATO summit meeting in Vilnius. However, before I touch on that, I think it's perhaps appropriate to say a few things about the situation again on the battlefronts, because it has now become completely clear what is going on in places like Vilnius is to a great extent decided by the situation on the battlefronts. And here we can see that the situation is deteriorating from Ukraine's point of view. Yesterday saw another major attack by Ukraine in the Rabotino area, south of Orechov, in the Zaporozhye region, as I understand it, trying to break through, this time again using mechanized, in a mechanized attack, very similar to the kind of attacks that Ukraine was launching in the first 2 weeks of the offensive back in June. And the results of these latest attacks have been every bit as disastrous as the results of those attacks back in June. Again, we see pictures of the steppes cluttered with burnt out armoured vehicles, tanks, allegedly at least 5 Leopard 2 tanks now destroyed, large numbers of other infantry fighting vehicles, including a significant number of Bradley infantry fighting vehicles and other armoured vehicles as well. I saw a report that claimed that over the course of this particular battle, Ukraine lost around 200 men killed and around 1,000 injured. This was not a report that was, I should say, clearly given by the Russian Defense Ministry, and perhaps one should take it with extreme caution. But anyway, it does seem as if Ukraine suffered significant losses in this particular attack. And the final humiliation is that a Bradley infantry fighting vehicle has now been captured intact by the Russians. It was abandoned by its crew on the battlefronts. A Russian party came and collected it, and it has been trundled off, and there are now photographs circulating on the internet of smiling Russian troops with this intact Bradley in the background. And no doubt the Bradley will be put on rails or a plane and will be flown off to Moscow, and Russian technicians will be poring over it, and no doubt they'll be inviting technicians from friendly countries like China and perhaps Iran, and these countries will now all get an insight into how the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle works, the kind of machine it is. I understand that these are not the most modern Bradleys in the US military, so they perhaps don't represent the current version of this machine operated by the United States. But regardless of that, it's both a humiliation and a leak of information about this vehicle, which will be useful to the Eurasian powers. I should say that, to the best of my knowledge, this is the first time that a Bradley has been captured by an adversary on the battlefield, or indeed in any circumstances. So a bad defeat in the Orechov sector of the Zaporozhye front lines. And there was also information that there's been further bad news for Ukraine in the Piatichatki sector. There were reports a couple of days ago that all the Ukrainian troops had been pulled out of that particular area. Well, some of them have clearly come back. There was attacks there yesterday. There were attacks there early this morning. These attacks apparently are different from the mechanized attack south of Orekhov. It's again light infantry, and again the attack was comprehensively and thoroughly repelled, with the Ukrainians again suffering heavy losses. Now, all of this is bad news for Ukraine, but it gets worse on other fronts, because we're now getting clearer reports about the situation in Avdiivka. And it does seem that the earlier reports that the Russians have made significant advances near Avdiivka. This is this town, formerly of 35,000 people, actually more properly a suburb, close to Donetsk city, which Ukraine has been occupying ever since the 2014 fighting, and from which Ukraine has anchored the greater part of the forces with which it has been striking at Donetsk with artillery and, in effect, conducting a siege of Donetsk. It's not the only place, and I should say that even if Avdiivka were to fall to the Russians, which is now starting to look like only a matter of time, then Donetsk city would still be within range of Ukrainian artillery, but it would be from a further distance. It would be more difficult to carry out artillery strikes on Donetsk city, and it would be, in any event, a major psychological blow for Ukraine to lose Avdiivka, pushing its forces further away from Donetsk city. A psychological blow for Ukraine, a psychological uplift for the people of Donetsk city, who've had to endure years of Ukrainian shelling. So, the latest reports suggest that the Russians may indeed have achieved fire control of the last road leading into Avdiivka, and that they're closing the circle round Avdiivka. And I should say that it looks as if, in contrast to what happened during the Battle of Bakhmut, for example, on this occasion the Russians are indeed intent on encircling Avdiivka and the Ukrainian group that is located in the town, entirely cutting it off from resupply, and in that case, ultimately, of course, forcing its surrender. Now, I say that, doubtless Ukraine will try to prevent that from happening. There will no doubt be Ukrainian counterattacks in the Avdiivka area over the next couple of days. Sometimes, as a result of these counterattacks, Ukraine is able to recover some ground, and that might push back the date of Avdiivka's eventual fall. And of course, there's also the other possibility, though it would be one very contrary to Ukrainian practice, of Ukraine actually pulling its troops back from Avdiivka, retreating, in other words, from the town, accepting that the town itself is essentially lost. Well, we'll see what the Ukrainians do, but for the moment, it does seem as if the situation in Avdiivka is becoming increasingly critical. Anyway, that, if anything, is overshadowed by very significant Russian advances on the northern battlefronts. And I've even seen some suggestions that, in fact, this is the most important part of the entire war at the moment. The area around Svatovo, Kremenaya, Liman, the town the Russians call Krasny Liman, and of course Kupiansk. And there's reports that the Russians have now entered a village or small town perhaps called Toretsk in this area, that they're gaining significant ground. There have been Ukrainian counterattacks. The Russians say that they have repelled these counterattacks, and the reports suggest that this is correct. And it seems that Russian forces are making steady gains in this area as they encroach upon the three towns that remain, that are the key to control in this area: Kupiansk to the north, Liman itself, and also Siversk, a town which the Russians came close to capturing in the summer of 2022 after the fall of Lysychansk, but which in the event they did not capture, which, as I said in previous videos, I think perhaps left their defences in the north of Donbass and in southern Kharkiv somewhat unanchored, opening the way for Ukraine's successful counterattack in the autumn. Anyway, if all of these three towns are eventually captured by the Russians, and it's starting to look as if that might be possible, then the effect of that Ukrainian offensive will have been effectively nullified, and in fact Ukraine will be in a worse operational position in the north of Donbass and in Kharkiv region than it was before that Ukrainian offensive in the autumn took place. So, all in all, bad news on the battlefronts for Ukraine, and humiliation with the loss of the Bradley in the Orekhov area. Is there any good news for Ukraine? Well, there continues to be lots of talk about advances, or perhaps advances by both sides, perhaps, in the Bakhmut area. Again, there were reports early this morning of more Ukrainian attacks in the Kleshayevka, Kordyumovka areas around Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut. There's even an interesting article in the Daily Telegraph about this, which is actually reasonably even-handed. It did acknowledge that there have been Ukrainian attacks, but it did also acknowledge that Ukraine has not yet managed to capture Kleshayevka, and it said that the fog of war over the fighting in and around Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut, is very heavy. And I would agree. I think that it's actually quite difficult to get a fully accurate picture of what is going on. And I think the reason for this is twofold. Firstly, the majority of Russian war reporters have relocated to the southern front, which is why we get such fast and accurate information about Ukraine's attacks in the Orekhov, Zaporozhye, Kherson, southern Donetsk regions. And we get less information, much less information from the Bakhmut area, and even less information from the areas further north in Donbass and Kharkiv. Even the Daily Telegraph has acknowledged that, by contrast, Ukraine is providing very little information. It's providing very little information, verifiable information, about what is actually going on in the area of the Bakhmut battlefronts. Anyway, for the record, I think that Ukraine is continuing to make strenuous attempts to try to regain ground in and around Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut. I think that the Russians repeatedly counterattack and push the Ukrainians back. I think that Kleshayevka and Kordyumovka, two villages that Ukraine appears to be trying to capture, are firmly under Russian control. And I think that with the arrival of the Chechen forces, the Russians are now in a position to match the numbers of Ukrainian troops who have been deployed in this area. It appears to be a force of around 67,000 men, at least according to the information we're getting from the Russians themselves. They put the number of troops in this area at about 67,000 men, and for all I know, that is a reasonable guesstimate of the actual number. And we've been told that Russian forces, by contrast, numbered around 50,000 before the Chechen forces came, and it looks as if with the Chechen forces that number will have increased to around 60,000, which ought to be enough to keep the situation, as I said, in Artyomivsk, Bakhmut, under control. But anyway, that's the one area where Ukraine perhaps still has some chances, some prospects, as I've discussed many times, as others have discussed many times. Following the fall of Bakhmut on the 20th of May, the Russians lack the time to fully consolidate their positions, and the result is that this is a perhaps more promising area for Ukraine to launch attacks than anywhere else on the front lines. And when also has the added factor that the commander of Ukraine's ground forces, General Syrskyi, seems to be located in this area and seems to have made Bakhmut some kind of personal mission. He was the person who insisted upon its defense, and he's the person who seems to have organized these counterattacks, including the counterattacks that took place in May, and this latest offensive that began in parallel with Ukraine's offensive in the south. And one gets the sense that for Syrskyi, this is a kind of private war that he has, rather difficult to understand why, and that he is intent on expending a huge number of men and machines trying to recapture Bakhmut. As I said yesterday, he made the extraordinary claim that Bakhmut is under Ukraine's fire control, a claim which, by the way, is clearly ridiculous, and which even that Daily Telegraph article I alluded to treats with extreme skepticism. I think the best summary of the state of the fighting in Bakhmut, or the former Bakhmut, in this area of the battlefield, is actually provided by a unnamed US veteran, clearly a military officer, to John Helmer, which has been published in John Helmer's very important article, Dancing with Bears, and on his blog, Dancing with Bears, which I will come back to shortly. But anyway, I'll just read out what this person, this American veteran, has to say about the fighting in and around Artyomivsk, Bakhmut. And it's interesting, and it gives us a clue as to the nature of the fighting there. And he says, this is a quote from Helmer's piece, but it's a quotation from this veteran. A clue to the effectiveness of Russian interdiction is the inability of the Ukrainians to concentrate powerful forces at any point to achieve a breakthrough. The concentration at Artyomivsk, Bakhmut, provides some clues. There are more than 60,000 Ukrainians and foreign legionnaires concentrated on that front. The composition is heavily mechanized and well supported by artillery. They are constantly in action, constantly on the attack, and yet, despite their being very menacing and able to bleed outnumbered Russian defenders, they've not achieved much whilst expending huge resources. And I think this is true. I think this is roughly what is happening in the Bakhmut area. And I think that, as I said, the arrival of these Chechen troops will soon redress the advantage in numbers that Ukraine appears to have in this particular part of the battle lines. I would add that Simplicus the thinker, who has a more detailed, granular knowledge of Russian military units that I do, says that the Russian military units that are defending Artyomovsk and the areas around are a mixed bag. Some of them are extremely proficient, highly trained, professional Russian regular army units. Others are less proficient, some of them being drawn from the Donbass militia. And he makes the interesting point, if that is so, that suggests that the Bakhmut front continues to receive less priority from the Russian General Staff than the other fronts, the one in Zaporozhye, and where the Russians are successfully defending, and the one in the north around Liman, Kupiansk, Svatovo, Kremenaya, Seversk, where the Russians are advancing. Anyway, we'll see what happens, and for the moment, as I said, as the Daily Telegraph helpfully said, the fog of war is very heavy on Artyomovsk, Bakhmut, but my impression is that there's been no Ukrainian breakthroughs, and for the record, if anything, I think that they've been pushed back. Anyway, that is the situation on the battlefronts. Has Ukraine made any other gains? Well, it seems to me they've only got one thing to show. They launched a missile attack on a town. I believe it's actually in Zaporozhye region, about in Kherson region, called Berdyansk. And this time they hit lucky, and apparently a lieutenant general of the Russian armed forces was killed. A senior officer, and one wonders what he was doing there in Berdyansk. But anyway, they did manage to reach that far, and this man was unlucky enough to be caught in the missile strike, and it seems the Russian Ministry of Defense has confirmed that he has indeed been killed. So they've achieved that. Overall, the strike itself doesn't seem to have changed anything much on the battle lines. And I do wonder, by the way, whether the missile strike might have been specifically targeted at him. Ukraine, as the military situation moves against it, seems to be trying to target individual Russian commanders. There was an assassination within Russia itself of a Russian submarine captain who was out on a jog. And again, it's fairly clear that the hitman was a special forces operative of the Ukrainian intelligence agencies. And, well, I have to say, taking pot shots at captains and generals might lift morale a little, but it's not going to change the pattern of the war, given the structure of the Russian army, which we discussed extensively on the Duran with Andrei Martyonev. The way the Russian army is organized is that it is able to absorb the loss of senior officers of that nature, even though, for obvious reasons, I'm sure the Russians are unhappy about it. Anyway, before I conclude with my discussions of the situation on the battlefronts, I wanted to say two things. Firstly, the Russian cruise missile and drone attacks continue unabated all across Ukraine. It's now clear that Russia has its own production line for uranium-2 drones, and the Russians are able to basically continue strikes all across Ukraine with unlimited numbers of these drones, which have become, in addition, more advanced, more sophisticated than they had been at the start when they first started to be used. The Russians have clearly worked on them. They may have improved the engine, substituted an engine of their own for the original Western sourced engine, but they've also clearly refined the guidance systems. And anyway, the Duranian true drones have become both more difficult to destroy and more effective in their use. And Russian missile strikes continue all across Ukraine at a continuous rate. And by the way, on that, and in addition to taken together with the fighting on the front lines, one is getting now almost unending pictures and films of Ukrainian vehicles, machines, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, armoured personnel carriers, factories, all kinds of places being destroyed. The video and photographic evidence, catalogue of this kind of thing over the last few days is bulging to impossible dimensions. You can find all these pictures on the internet if you want to look for them. With my eyesight issues, I'm not the best person to assess these pictures, but anyway, they're all over the place now, and they are very extensive, and they give a harrowing picture of the hammering, the daily hammering that Ukraine is taking. The second thing I wanted to say is that the Russians claimed yesterday that Ukraine attacked the town of Tokmak in Zaporozhye with cluster munitions. These were presumably artillery fired, but perhaps they were launched from HIMARS rockets, I don't know. But the Russians have threatened that if Ukraine starts using cluster munitions, specifically the cluster munitions it has been supplied by the United States, the Russians will start using these cluster munitions to a much greater degree, and that they've up to now held back from doing so, but if Ukraine starts to use cluster munitions, they will use these munitions themselves with no inhibitions. And the Russians have pointed out that they have a huge stockpile, much bigger than the American one, of these munitions. They point out, or rather they claim, that their munitions are deadlier and, I suppose, better than the American munitions. I'm not going to try and assess whether that is true. I find that a distasteful comparison. I'm not going to even try to go there. But one thing I will say is that there does seem to be no doubt that the Russians have a much broader range of these munitions than the United States does, or than the United States is able to supply. They have more of these munitions for use with long-range multiple rocket launch systems, for example, and rockets and bombs and shells and things of that kind than the United States does. And some of these Russian cluster munitions do appear to be significantly bigger. And on that topic, on the topic of cluster munitions, there's been a piece on 1945 by Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis. He also says that cluster munitions are not going to be a game changer on the battlefields. And he says that when they were used in fighting against the Iraqis, in which he was involved, they were effective, they were used effectively, but they demanded a very high degree of proficiency in their use. And he said that Ukraine doesn't have that proficiency. It doesn't have the training and the skills and the range of equipment and the surveillance methods, the battlefield surveillance methods, and the coordination with other types of vehicles and machines necessary to make use of these cluster munitions effective. And on the topic of training, Lieutenant Colonel Davis makes the point that the commander of Ukraine's 47th Mechanized Brigade, that's the brigade that was originally supplied with the Bradleys, and which is perhaps, from a Ukrainian point of view, an elite brigade and a Western trained brigade. Anyway, he points out that the commander of the 47th Brigade is 28-year-old colonel, and he makes the point that such a person, such a young man, cannot conceivably have obtained the kind of training that an analogous officer, an officer of colonel rank, would have in the United States. He says he's only likely to have the level of experience and training that in the US Army would be possessed by a second lieutenant. So, quite a remarkable claim from Lieutenant Colonel Davis. Anyway, moving on, the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, has given an extraordinarily interesting interview. It's, I think, one of the first interviews, first interviews he's given, certainly since the start of the offensive. Shoigu, by the way, has been busy. He's been inspecting troops in all sorts of places on the battlefronts. He also inspects various Russian factories where weapons are being produced. My understanding of the arrangement is that the civilian officials, Medvedev, and the other government officials who are responsible for the production of weapons, they organize weapons production. Shoigu's job is to pass on to the civilian leaders the Defense Ministry's requirements, its orders for particular weapons, and to coordinate with the commanders and the general staff to make sure that those orders match the needs of the military, and his inspections of the factories are primarily intended to see that the orders that the Defense Ministry is placing are being properly fulfilled. So he doesn't have an actual role in the production side. He has, if you like, a role on the consumption side. He is acting as the end user, the customer. But that in itself, by the way, does require significant organizational skills. Anyway, his comments in this interview are only partially about that, and I will read the complete interview as translated. The translation has been provided by the Russian Ministry of Defense. And this is what the interview says. Since the spring, the Western countries, this is a question, have long been frightening everyone with an offensive by the Ukrainian military towards Zaporozhye and Crimea. Huge amounts of NATO arms and equipment were supplied to the Kiev regime for this purpose. Today, the NATO summit begins in Vilnius. What wouldn't they tell about the results of their plans? So that's the question. And Shoigu responds, in my opinion, they promoted and escalated the counteroffensive so much that practically, if not half the world, then a third of it was waiting for the 11th, in other words, for the start of the Vilnius summit. To summarize what they had achieved during this widely publicized and announced, as they called it, strategic counteroffensive. In the end, what did they come to the NATO summit with? And then he lists Ukrainian losses. Since 4th June, enemy losses have amounted to more than 26,000 servicemen and 3,000 units of various armaments. Now, 26,000, he's not saying that 26,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed. He has said that 26,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed or so severely wounded that they're not able to continue fighting, at least for the time being. And then he talks about 3,000 units of armaments that have been destroyed, and he says these include 21 aircraft, 5 helicopters. 21 aircraft clearly means jet aircraft, 5 helicopters, 1,244 tanks and other armoured fighting vehicles. Among them were 17 German-manufactured Leopard tanks. That number has certainly been exceeded by now. The reports are that at least 5 have been destroyed in the fighting in the Orechov sector that I discussed earlier in this programme. So we're probably now talking at significantly more than 20. 5 French-manufactured AMX wheeled tanks, and then he says 12 US-manufactured Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. Now that is certainly too low. I think that there is significant photographic evidence that a significantly larger number of these Bradleys have been destroyed, and now, as I said, one has been captured. I'm not sure why Shoigu has given this low figure of only 12. Perhaps this is just an error. Anyway, he goes on to say, in addition, we destroyed 914 units of special military vehicles, 2 anti-aircraft missile systems, 25 multiple launch rocket systems, 403 field artillery and mortars. And then he goes on to say this is an important figure because the main damage is always inflicted by artillery. I will repeat once again, 403 guns, including 43 manufactured M777 artillery systems and 46 self-propelled artillery systems from Poland, the United States and France. And by the way, we saw yesterday more evidence of more infantry fighting vehicles, of self-propelled howitzers having been destroyed, including Polish Crabs and a British vehicle as well, British self-propelled gun, which curiously enough, again, Shoigu doesn't mention Britain here. And then he goes on to say Russian air defense facilities intercepted 176 HIMARS projectiles, 27 Storm Shadow cruise missiles. This is a very large number of Storm Shadows. I'm assuming, by the way, that the strike on Berdyansk, which killed that Lieutenant General, was also carried out with Storm Shadows. I don't know how many Storm Shadows Ukraine was supplied. The fact that they've had to ask France for supplemental supplies of Scalp missiles, which are essentially the same as the British Storm Shadow, suggests that they might be starting to run low, and that might also explain why the subject of supplying ATACMS missiles from the United States has now restarted in earnest. It's probable that the Storm Shadows have proved disappointing and that the stock of them is running low, and so there are now demands to send ATACMS missiles in their place. Apparently there is, on this occasion at least, stronger pushback from the Pentagon. They're saying that they don't have that many of these ATACMS missiles and that they need them for other places and that they don't want to see them all, or most of them, or many of them, burnt up in Ukraine. For the record, I believe that Ukraine will eventually get its ATACMS missiles. Anyway, the 483 unmanned aerial vehicles that Shoigu, again, talks about is, as I said on many occasions, something of a puzzle, because Western media have previously claimed that Ukraine is losing 10,000 drones a month, so which is a significantly more than 483. But I suspect, as I said, Shoigu's counting different things probably the bigger, more sophisticated drones, rather than the small commercial drones that Ukraine has been cobbling together and trying to use, with diminishing success, by the way, on the battlefronts. And then Shoigu goes on to say the enemy did not achieve its objectives in any of the directions. Moreover, we continue to carry out effective strikes with long-range precision weapons against Ukrainian reserves and military equipment arriving from the Western countries, significantly reducing the enemy offensive potential. We know that the results of our combat work are carefully monitored and analysed by foreign intelligence, primarily by the United States and NATO countries. They note the high efficiency of our defence lines, the mines set up, the quality of the work of the army and ground attack aviation in launching preemptive strikes against identified enemy targets. They particularly emphasise, they stress, the supreme steadfastness of our servicemen and the prompt response of our commanders to changes in the situation. One wonders how Shoigu knows all of this. Is he just guessing? Or perhaps the Russians have sources. Who's to say? Anyway, to continue. Next question. Are the Ukrainians continuing their unsuccessful cannon fodder assaults? Cannon fodder means light infantry assaults, which result in heavy losses. And Shoigu responds, yes, they are conducting active operations, trying to break through our defences in various directions. Just the last 2 days, several waves of attacks were launched against the units of the 7th Company of the 7th Motorised Rifle Regiment and the 291st Regiment of the 42nd Motorised Rifle Division. As a result of 2 days of almost continuous fighting, the enemy lost up to 90 men, 4 tanks, including 3 Leopard tanks, and 15 infantry fighting vehicles, including 6 Bradleys. So he seems to be upgrading the number of Bradleys that have been destroyed. Anyway, he then goes on to say, in the Krasny Liman direction, assault detachments of the 15th and 21st Motorised Rifle Brigades of the Center Group of Forces repelled a Ukrainian attack by a Ukrainian motorized infantry company close to Karmazinovka. And this next paragraph is written in bold. He says, this is from the Russian Defense Ministry's own website, I would like to emphasize in particular that despite his busy schedule, the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, which is to say Putin, listens in detail twice a day to the command of the combined grouping, as well as to the commanders on the situation. All commanders at all levels understand and feel the full measure of the responsibility that has been placed on them and honourably carry out their tasks. And then the next question is, Washington announced that the United States will supply the Kiev regime with cluster munitions, how that fact alone will change the course of the special military operation. And then Shoigu replies, the world has already witnessed the United States' willingness to send cluster munitions. Washington justifies it in different ways. They say that given the fact that conventional ammunition of 155 caliber has already actually run out, so now, until their production is deployed, they decided to cover it with these cluster munitions. Naturally, it will result in prolonging the conflict. Neither we, nor the Americans, nor Kiev are parties to the Convention on Cluster Munitions. At the same time, Russia, realizing the threat such weaponry pose to civilian population, has refrained and will refrain from using them in the special military operation area. In the event that the United States supplies cluster munitions to Ukraine, the Russian armed forces will be forced to use similar weapons against the armed forces of Ukraine. As a response, it should be noted that Russia has cluster munitions in service for all occasions, also much more effective than American ones. We have more types of that particular weaponry for different purposes. At present, the command of the joint group of forces in the special military operation area is taking additional organizational and technical measures to protect personnel and hardware from the destructive elements of cluster munitions. And then we have one of the most interesting sections, which is about military production, defense production. And the question is, you visit enterprises of the defense industry complex on a regular basis. What can you tell us about the status of the state defense order to satisfy all needs of the Russian armed forces? And Shoigu responds, a lot of work is put into it, to say the least. All efforts began last year. In the shortest possible time, the enterprises of the military-industrial complex managed to increase the production of most needed types of weaponry, military and special hardware, as well as means of destruction to perform combat missions. And most importantly, to ensure their accelerated delivery to the troops. And this is important because, of course, it takes much longer for weaponry from the West to reach Ukraine, whereas the Russians are able to send equipment much faster. And he says this, from March 2022, the number of purchased and modernized main weaponry, military and special hardware supplied under the state defense order has increased by 1.8 times. And I think what he's referring to is things like heavy equipment, tanks, military equipment of that kind, infantry fighting vehicles, guns, that sort of thing. And then he goes on to say this, and in 2023, more than 5 times compared to the beginning of 2022. So, production of military equipment seems to have doubled in 2022, and in 2023 it's increased 5-fold as compared with the situation before the war started. So he then gives some numbers. He says deliveries of Orlan 10 and Orlan 30 drones, these are reconnaissance drones, have increased by 53 times. Kamaz increased deliveries of multi-purpose vehicles, these are trucks, by 17.6 times. Ural Vagon Zavod increased deliveries and overhaul of T-72 and T-90 tanks by 3.6 times. The Kurgan machine building plant increased supplies and overhaul of BMP-3s by 2.1 times. The Arzamas machine building plant increased deliveries of BTR-82A, that's a wheeled armoured personnel carrier, by 4 times, and Tiger M, that's the Russian equivalent of the Humvee, a better machine than the Humvee, by 2 times. As for Army aviation, supplies of Kamov-52 helicopters have increased by 2 times, and Mi-28, that is another type of helicopter gunship, by 3 times. The Ural automobile plant increased deliveries of cars, it doesn't make clear what that means, by 8 times. Almost a similar growth for a wide range of ammunition of different caliber and purpose. And that doesn't give us any real idea of exactly what he's referring to. Different ammunitions of different caliber and purpose might imply artillery ammunition or small or rounds for rifles, small caliber rounds. But anyway, the implication is that that has increased by around 8 times. But he might be giving a global total. And he says almost the similar growth, purchases of necessary means of destruction in 2022 were increased by 2 times. And again, He doesn't tell us what that means exactly. That could be cruise missiles. But note that's 2022. He's not giving us figures for 2023. Anyway, there we go. That's what Shoigu says, a massive increase in military production. And huge losses by Ukraine on the battlefronts, an offensive that has failed to make any breakthroughs. And he's, by the way, also confirmed in passing that Putin gets briefed about the progress of the conflict twice a day. So, an interesting interview by Shoigu, and one which reflects the growing optimism of the Russian military as they deal with this battle, this conflict. Now, all of this leads me to what has happened at Vilnius. Now, as of the time of speaking, as the time of making this video, there are still things that are unknown. We know now that Ukraine has not been admitted into NATO or given any kind of timetable or promise as to when or how it will eventually become a member of NATO. The NATO final communique, which is very long, by the way, repeatedly speaks about NATO, Ukraine's place being within NATO. It talks endlessly about and ferociously about Russia's illegal and brutal war of aggression against Ukraine. It recommits to Ukraine's territorial sovereignty, including Crimea. It essentially says all of those things, but it did not provide Ukraine with any kind of plan to join NATO. It says that Ukraine is not going to need a membership action plan, but actually, in a kind of a way, as I discussed yesterday, that puts Ukraine in an even more complex or difficult position, because if Ukraine had at least been given a membership action plan, it would have been given a plan it could work towards, and presumably a timeline in order to eventually qualify for NATO membership. Saying that Ukraine doesn't need a membership action plan is in effect saying that Ukraine doesn't need a timetable or a plan of any kind in order to prepare itself for NATO membership. So it's not actually beneficial to Ukraine. And the communique has instead those words quoted by so many people, that Ukraine will eventually join NATO when every member state agrees and when the conditions are right. But we're not told, of course, what those conditions are, except that the conflict with Russia must end. And Jens Stoltenberg, perhaps unintentionally, has raised the bar even higher, because he speaks about the war ending with a Ukrainian victory before there can even be a discussion of Ukrainian membership of NATO. So that's what NATO says. Now, Ukraine has been given a NATO-Russia Council, but it's perhaps worth pointing out that before the formation or the announcement of this NATO-Ukraine Council, there was already a NATO-Ukraine Commission. Now, no doubt, changing the name from Commission to Council upgrades it in some ways, but Ukrainians are probably justified in saying that this is just a change of name. It's just repackaging something that they've already had, giving it a new name and passing it off as something different. Now, we have been told that Ukraine is going to be provided with some kind of security guarantees by the West. As of the time of the making of this video, what those security guarantees are has not been announced. And importantly, it seems that the security guarantees will not be provided by Western states as members of NATO, but in a different capacity by the leading members of the leading states of the West in their capacity as the G7, which, always remember, is supposed to be an economic association, principally, rather than a security one. But anyway, we haven't yet been told what these arrangements are, but it's clear that they will fall well short of any commitment to come to Ukraine's defense in the event of a war with Russia or a renewal of any war with Russia in the future. It's just a commitment to continue to supply Ukraine with weapon systems and equipment, which of course is what the West has been doing actively, not just over the last year and a half, during the period of the special military operation, but before. Something the extent to which I had not realized, but my source, who has had contacts with the Wagner organization, has previously told me that, contrary to President Obama's statements about a policy decision about the fact that the United States would not supply weapons to Ukraine, in fact, supplies of Javelin missiles began quietly already when he was president. Very characteristic, by the way, if it is true, of Obama, who was, in my opinion, a very serpentine and guileful character, somebody who was difficult to pin down and whose statements and commitments on such things are perhaps taken a little too seriously by some people. Anyway, Zelensky is furious with all of this, and it's understandable why. From his point of view, he was catapulted into an offensive, which many of his military officials, his key military advisor, General Zaluzhny, didn't want. And he was told that this had to happen before the NATO summit, and he was clearly expecting or anticipating that in return for launching this offensive, there would be some much more clear-cut commitment for Ukraine's membership of NATO. And he has made his anger and disappointment clear. And he's made some extremely harsh statements criticizing Western leaders and criticizing NATO for its supposedly pusillanimous start. We've had reports in the Washington Post that Zelensky's comments have angered the United States, angered the administration. We have also had comments from the British Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, who seems to be angered as well by Zelensky's behaviour, and who says that Ukraine should be grateful for all the weapons it's received. And anyway, there's been, to some extent, something of a row. Now, a lot of people have commented on some of the photographs that have appeared of the first day at Vilnius. Zelensky was not invited to participate in any of the NATO discussions on the first day. And there's a rather terrible photograph in which you see all these NATO officials busy chatting, talking to each other, embracing, speaking, and a solitary Zelensky glowering all by himself, standing just ahead of them. There's also, by the way, a picture of him sitting next to Erdogan, with Erdogan looking extremely grumpy and annoyed. And there's also what looks like the body language, pictures of a rather chilly meeting between Zelensky and Jens Stoltenberg. Now, I'm going to say that I think that there is some justification for both sides, both the Ukrainians and the Western powers. At least, shall we say, not perhaps justification, but some explanations, some reasons why each would be angry with the other. From the Western point of view, they have given Ukraine an enormous amount of money, an enormous amount of military equipment. They must be getting increasingly impatient with the incredible sense of entitlement that Ukraine appears to have. It's a seemingly limitless demand for more and more weapon systems, for unlimited Western support, up to and including a willingness on the part of the West to go to war on its behalf. And I can understand that this is beginning to grate. But the Ukrainians also, it seems to me, have good cause to be angry, because they can justifiably say that they've been led up the garden path. Back in March, they had reached what was, in all respects, an agreement with the Russians. Would not have been a full or complete agreement. There was still work to do on it, but the principles for a settlement were there on the table and had been initialed by Ukraine's own chief negotiator and apparently presumably with the consent of Zelensky himself. And then, of course, it was the Western powers who came and talked the Ukrainians out of this. And Boris Johnson telephoned Zelensky and then visited Kiev and got Zelensky to change course, as did the United States. We know this from Naftali Bennett, the Israeli Prime Minister. We know this from Cavusoglu, the Turkish Foreign Minister. And the Ukrainians turned their backs on a settlement of the war that was there on the table and to which they'd agreed in principle. And it seems that part of the inducements the Western powers gave to get them to turn their backs on that agreement was in effect promises of unlimited Western military support. And one can't avoid the sense that Ukrainians are justified in feeling bitter that that unlimited Western support that they probably relied upon has turned out to be much more limited after all. That disastrous phrase, supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes, is, by the way, still there in the NATO communique. Given what has actually come out of Vilnius, the Ukrainians must choke when they read it. Now, Ukraine has been promised more aid, but as a number of people have spotted, the aid that is going to be supplied to Ukraine is going to be, we're told, substantial, which actually suggests that it might be less than what Ukraine has been receiving in the past. And the reason for that, as has been discussed exhaustively on this channel, on the Duran, by Brian Beletic, by so many others, is because NATO has basically run through all that it can give. I have, by the way, obtained a little bit more information about Ukraine's expenditure of ammunition rate. The Pentagon says that it's only 3,000 rounds a month. If this is true during the offensive that is ongoing at the moment, then that undoubtedly explains the massive mismatch between what Ukraine is doing and what the Russians are doing. And it's been pointed out that if the United States is eventually able to increase its production rates for 155mm artillery shell ammunition to 85,000 rounds a month, which is apparently the plan, then that will just cover Ukraine's daily use at this very low rate, or comparatively low rate, compared to the Russians. Whereas, and of course, the reality is that the United States is not going to give all that ammunition that it produces to Ukraine. It will have to hold back some of it for itself. So, there is nothing much more to give. The F-16s will no doubt come, but it now seems increasingly likely that they won't come before 2024. The ATACMS missiles will probably come. Storm Shadows may be running out. France is going to supply 40 identical types of missiles, essentially identical. They're called Scalp in France, but they're basically the same as the Storm Shadow. 40. Shoigu has just said that since the 4th of June, the Russians have shot down 27. So one can start to see, increasingly see, the problems. And ammunition, as Shoigu says, is the key to this war. The Russians have fought the war in that way to make it so. And the Ukrainians may be angry and they may be bitter, but the reality is the cupboard is almost bare. And that is why we've had this extraordinary statement in Vilnius. Now, this brings me back to John Helmer's article, which I think is one of the most important articles written over the course of this war up to now. And he says that NATO has agreed on a secret 6-month plan for Ukraine. It's a case of do or die by December. I'm quoting directly. Either the Ukrainian forces firing everything that NATO allies can give them, from cluster munitions to Franco-German Storm Shadow missiles and German Leopard tanks, gain territory and advantage over the Russians, or else the Kiev regime will be destroyed and must fall back on Lvov, while NATO beats its own retreat westward from the Polish and Romanian borders. Its military capabilities defeated, but its Article 5 intact. Now, Helmer says that this is a secret plan, except, as he also points out, it's not. As Helmer correctly says, and as I noticed yesterday, the existence of this plan has actually been leaked, essentially, by no less a person than the Czech president, Petr Pavel, who I am increasingly coming to the view is a very complex and intricate figure indeed. He is universally seen as pro-Western, and of course his current stance is, certainly by comparison with the previous Czech president, who was much more sympathetic to Russia. But anyway, Pavel comes across as being a strong supporter of NATO and of the West. He's a former military officer and NATO general and all that. But in fact, every so often he comes out with statements which tell us a great deal about the war, the progress of the war, and about the NATO position, and which actually, if you unpack them carefully, suggest that deep down he knows the truth and that he's actually hedging. Anyway, to come back to Helmer, this is what Helmer says. It's hardly a secret. The secret plan is hardly a secret. And he then quotes Czech President Pavel. Whatever is achieved by the end of this year will be the baseline for negotiations. There is no more than a 6-month window of opportunity, Pavel added. This is all from Pavel, which will more or less close by the end of this year. After that, we will see another decline of willingness to massively support Ukraine with more weapons. And then Helmer has a very interesting discussion of Russian military calculations, which is taken from the Russian newspaper Redovka, which I have, of course, quoted many times. And it says, and this is essentially a calculation, as I said, drawn from which is to some extent open sourced, but which Helmer thinks is in fact originates with the Russian General Staff, and it says that at the current rate of battlefield casualties, by December 31st, the Ukrainian army will lose between 75 and 100,000 dead and up to 300,000 wounded and out of combat. In parallel, the destruction of NATO weapons will accelerate faster than the NATO states can resupply and deliver them, or replacement parts keep the surviving stock going at the front. And by that time, Russia's General Winter takes control of the battlefield. There will be too few Ukrainian fighting men left. We come back to the fact that, as Lieutenant Colonel Davis said, the commander of the 47th Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian Army is only 28 years old, and insufficient weapons and ammunition to resist the start of the Russian offensive. And let me reiterate again, there is a huge incremental Russian build-up underway, much bigger than the one that took place over the course of the autumn and winter and spring. This is on a completely different scale. 1,400 men joining the Russian military every day, tank armies and being trained up. And anyway, we'll see when they're ready and what the Russians are prepared to do with it. And Helmer goes on to say, a demilitarized zone of mines and cluster bomblets will have taken shape over several hundred kilometers west of the surrendering Odessa, Nikolaev, and Kharkiv. And he predicts that Ukraine will, by that point, be faced with the prospect of having to withdraw from Kiev itself. And Helmer goes on to say, and on this I think he has sources, and he may be right, that over the course of the July 29th meeting between Putin and not just Prigozhin, but the chiefs of the Wagner organization, the military chiefs, apparently Putin is supposed to have said that the Russians would continue fighting until the Ukrainians are pushed back all the way to Lvov. Now, that may sound unlikely. I mean, would Putin really have disclosed something like that to Prigozhin of all people? Though I would say that the Russians have been busy closing down all of Prigozhin's media outlets, so that in effect, whatever he's told, he can't communicate, at least to the public. But at an earlier meeting with Russian war correspondents that took place last month, of which only a part of the meeting was made public, Putin did float the possibility of a Russian advance to Kiev, and I have heard of rumours that in the private discussions he went, which took place after the public part, he actually went further and said something not dissimilar from what Helmer says that he told the Wagner commanders at this meeting on the 29th. So there we are. It does seem as if the sands are starting to fall. The clock is now ticking, and that NATO, in effect, through the decisions which have been taken in Vilnius, is quietly starting to prepare for the prospect of a Ukrainian defeat. Now, the entire point about the Ukrainian counteroffensive, and this is something that needs to be very well understood, is that it was supposed to be, as Shoigu, by the way, said in that interview that I quoted earlier, it was supposed to be prepared for in advance of the meeting in Vilnius. The expectation was that the Ukrainians would have made substantial gains. They'd have broken through all the way to the Black Sea, to the Sea of Azov. NATO at the summit in Vilnius would have been able to deliver what was in effect an ultimatum to the Russians to step down and abandon the war, and Ukraine perhaps would not have been immediately admitted to NATO, but it would have been given, at the very least, a NATO membership action plan. What has now happened is two things. Firstly, Ukraine has failed to break through and is stuck on the front lines. And secondly, the United States has run out of ammunition and can only give cluster shells, cluster munitions, which are not effective for the kind of war that Ukraine up to this point has been fighting. So the result is a retreat by NATO, a retreat with these vague communiques about Ukraine joining NATO one day, its place belongs in the alliance and all of that, but no membership action plan, no timeline, no clear proposals, conditions which are left in the air. We don't know what those conditions are, nor does Ukraine. Statements that Ukraine can only join after it defeats the Russians, but there's no sign that that will ever happen. And at the same time, we also see apparent deadlines being given to the Ukrainians. They've been told, you've got 6 months. Beyond the end of the year, we're not able to do much more to help you beyond that which we have already done. And Helmer speculates that the expectation, the plan on both sides, both the Russian and the Western, is that the Ukrainians abandon Kiev, pull back to Lvov, try to set up some kind of a some kind of a statelet there, presumably, which the Western powers might try to protect Anyway, that's too far into the future, too far ahead. I'm not going to discuss eventualities like that when we're still fighting in Donbass. Anyway, one way or the other, a summit meeting that has ended in an anticlimax that really hasn't produced much or anything of substance. I noticed, by the way, that the media in Britain, at least, is downplaying heavily its reporting of it. The one thing that is missing, and this should be obvious, is any kind of agreed negotiation strategy. There would need to be, one would have thought, at the conclusion of this, or in the lead up to the conclusion of this, some kind of discussion with the Russians. All there is a rather curious, interesting paragraph in the NATO communique that they do want to keep lines of communication with the Russians open. But open to what end? What are they prepared to put forward to the Russians? What ideas do they have that the Russians can work with? For the moment, I suspect that that is too difficult. It's clear that this particular NATO communique has been a hard struggle to put together already, and coming up with some kind of negotiation strategy is going to be too difficult for the West, has been too difficult for the West up to this point to do. But it seems they have, in effect, acknowledged that there's only about 6 months left before things become critical, and that doesn't leave very much time to put some kind of negotiation strategy together. Given that this appears to be the acknowledged outcome, at least acknowledged behind the scenes, one wonders why they don't start those negotiations now and save all of those lives on the battlefields which would otherwise die. But there we are. That's perhaps asking and expecting too much. Vilnius and the events on the battlefield are not the only news. We've had confirmation from the Chinese government that President Putin has been invited and will be travelling to Beijing in October, where he will be meeting with Xi Jinping. And no doubt this will be a very important meeting indeed. And note that it will be coming at a critical time when most probably the Russians will be preparing for some kind of offensive, or at least the Ukrainian offensive will have no doubt run its course. So that is going to be a meeting to wait for and think about. But anyway, for the moment at least, this is where my program ends. I hope it's been helpful to you, working your way through the events that have happened. To be very clear, and as I hope I've made clear in this program, it is events on the battlefield that are determining now the diplomatic outcomes. If the offensive had been successful, Vilnius would have been a very different summit. But the fact that the offensive has not been successful up to this point has resulted in this shabby compromise, leaving the Ukrainians, in effect, out in the cold, but without apparently agreeing any kind of strategy for trying to rebuild relations with the Russians. Well, thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. Just to remind you that you can find all our videos on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can also check out our shop, where we have all the amazing things that you will find. There are magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.